The sun rose over the New Mexico territory like a furnace door opening, spilling heat across the valley in waves that would build throughout the day until the very air seemed to shimmer with menace. Maria Gonzalez had been awake since before dawn, her hands already moving through the motions of breakfast preparation, while her mind catalogued the day's endless tasks. At 28, she looked a decade older, her face weathered by the brutal combination of sun, wind, and exhaustion that defined life on the small homestead she and her late husband had claimed. 5 years earlier, her husband Vicent had died 8 months ago, kicked in the chest by a spooked horse. The local doctor, such as he was, had done what he could, but internal bleeding was beyond his primitive capabilities. Vicent had lasted 3 days, each breath more labored than the last, until finally he simply stopped breathing one cool October morning. Maria had held his hand through it all, and when it was over, she'd allowed herself exactly 1 day of grief before returning to the fields. The land didn't care about widows or mourning. The land demanded constant attention, constant labor, or it would reclaim what had been carved from it with such effort. Now, as the first true heat of summer approached, Maria stood in the doorway of the small adobe house and looked out at her domain. 40 acres, most of it rocky and stubborn, but with a creek running through the eastern section that made irrigation possible. Vicent had planted corn, beans, and squash in the traditional way, and Maria had maintained his crops as best she could. But she was one person doing the work of two, and the strain was beginning to show in more than just her appearance. Her hands were a testament to her labor, calloused, scarred, the nails broken and permanently stained with dirt. Her back ached constantly, a dull throb that occasionally sharpened into real pain when she bent wrong or lifted something too heavy. Her shoulders bore the permanent impression of the yoke she used to carry water from the creek, and her feet were tough as leather from walking the furrows in worn boots that should have been replaced a year ago. She had 2 children, Miguel, who was 9, and little Rosa, barely 6. They helped as they could, but they were still children, and Maria refused to work them the way she worked herself. They needed school, needed play, needed some remnant of childhood even in this harsh place. So she rose earlier and worked later, pushing herself through the days with a determination that was equal parts necessity and stubbornness. The neighbors were sparse and struggling themselves. The Johnsons to the south were decent enough, but they had their own problems and their own acres to tend. To the north, the land remained unclaimed, a stretch of rocky scrubland that extended for miles before giving way to the foothills of the mountains. It was Apache country, or had been. The Apache had been mostly driven out now, confined to reservations or fled into Mexico, though everyone knew there were still small bands who refused to surrender, who moved through the mountains, like smoke visible one moment and gone the next. Maria didn't think much about the Apache. She was too busy surviving to worry about threats that might or might not materialize. The Army had a garrison at Fort Stanton, a day's ride to the northeast, and that was supposed to be enough to keep everyone safe. Mostly it was. But sometimes riders would come through with news of attacks, of ranches burned, of cattle taken. The fear would rise then, sharp and immediate, but it always faded back into the background noise of worry that accompanied frontier life. This particular morning, Maria moved through her routine with mechanical efficiency. She woke the children, fed them a breakfast of beans and tortillas, then sent them to their small tasks while she headed to the fields. The corn was knee-high now and would need weeding. After that, she needed to check the irrigation ditches, repair a section of fence that had come loose, and somehow find time to work on the vegetable garden closer to the house. The list was endless, each task bleeding into the next. She grabbed her hoe and a wide-brimmed hat that had been Vicent's, then started toward the cornfield. The morning was still relatively cool, which meant she might get 4 or 5 hours of work in before the heat became truly dangerous. She'd learned to pace herself, to drink water even when she wasn't thirsty, to watch for the signs of heat exhaustion that could drop a person where they stood. The cornfield stretched before her in neat rows, green and promising. This crop was important. It would feed her family through the winter and provide seed for next year. If she could bring in a good harvest, she might even have enough surplus to trade for the things they couldn't grow or make themselves: cloth, tools, perhaps even a new pair of boots. She began hoeing, moving down the row with practiced efficiency. The weeds were persistent, popping up overnight it seemed, and they competed with the corn for water and nutrients. Each one she cut down was a small victory, but there were thousands more waiting. The sun climbed higher, and she felt sweat begin to trickle down her back. She ignored it and kept working. By mid-morning, she'd cleared 3 rows. Her hands were cramping from gripping the hoe, and her back was starting to protest more loudly. She straightened slowly, one hand pressed to her lower back, and looked out across the field. So much left to do. Always so much left to do. She took a long drink from the water jug she'd brought with her, then bent back to her task. She didn't hear the approach. One moment she was alone in the field, and the next she felt a presence behind her, close enough that her body registered it before her mind fully processed the information. She spun around, hoe raised defensively, heart hammering against her ribs. The man standing there raised his hands slowly, palms out, in a gesture of peace. He was Apache, unmistakably so, with long dark hair held back by a red cloth band, and wearing a mixture of traditional clothing and items clearly taken from the white man's world. He was perhaps 40, lean and hard, muscled, his face weathered by sun and experience. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, dark and intelligent, watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately interpret. "I mean no harm," he said in accented but clear Spanish. His voice was calm, measured, as though he was speaking to a spooked animal. Maria kept the hoe raised, her mind racing. An Apache, here, on her land, in the middle of the morning. Every story she'd ever heard about Apache raids suddenly felt very immediate and very real. She glanced quickly toward the house, where her children were playing. Too far to run, too far to warn them. "What do you want?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was something. The Apache man's eyes moved past her, taking in the field, the irrigation ditches, the distant house. When his gaze returned to her, there was something like understanding in it. "You are alone here." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "My husband is in the north field." The lie came automatically, a defense. One corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile. "There is no one in the north field. There is only you and 2 small ones." Her hands tightened on the hoe. "If you've hurt my children, I have not touched them. They are playing near the house." He paused, then said, "You are killing yourself, trying to do the work of 3 people." The observation was so unexpected that Maria almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she said, "That's none of your concern. State your business and go." He was quiet for a moment, his eyes still on her face. Then he said something that would change everything. "Let me carry that load." She blinked, certain she'd misheard. "What? Your burden. It is too much for one person. Let me help you carry it." Now she did laugh, though it came out harsh and disbelieving. "Help me? You're Apache. Your people have been raiding settlements for years. Why would you help me?" "Not my people," he said quietly. "Not anymore." There was something in his voice, a weight of loss, that made her look at him more carefully. "My people are scattered. Some are on reservations, slowly dying of disease and despair. Some have fled to Mexico. A few, like me, remain in the mountains, neither surrendered nor willing to continue a war that cannot be won. That doesn't explain why you'd help me." He looked out across the field again, and when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "I have watched you for 3 days. I have seen you work from before sunrise until after dark. I have seen you carrying loads that would make a strong man struggle. I have seen you go into your house at night and come out the next morning to do it all again. You are strong, but even the strong can break." The idea that he'd been watching her, that he'd been close enough to observe her daily routine without her knowing, should have terrified her. And it did, but beneath the fear was something else. Curiosity, maybe, or just exhaustion that made even fear seem like too much effort. "Why?" she asked again, more softly this time. He met her eyes. "Because I understand what it is to be alone. Because I know what it is to lose everything and still have to continue. Because—" He paused, seemed to choose his words carefully. "Because the old ways are dying, and perhaps there are new ways that could be better, for all of us." Maria stood there in the hot sun, hoe still raised though her arms were beginning to tremble with fatigue, and tried to decide what to do. Every sensible bone in her body told her to order him off her land, to take her children and lock themselves in the house until he was gone. But another part of her, a part she hadn't listened to in months, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was an opportunity. "What's your name?" she heard herself ask. "In your language, it would translate to he who stands apart, but you can call me what the Mexican traders called me, Alejandro, Maria," she said, and finally lowered the hoe. That was how it began, with a moment of madness in a cornfield under the brutal New Mexico sun. Alejandro came back the next day, and the day after that. At first, Maria watched him constantly, never quite trusting, never letting him near her children. But he worked, and he worked hard. He knew things about the land that she didn't, tricks for conserving water and encouraging growth that had been developed over centuries of living in this harsh environment. He showed her how to use stones to capture morning dew, how to build simple shade structures that would protect the young plants from the worst of the midday heat, how to read the sky and know when rain was coming days before it arrived. He repaired her irrigation ditches, making them more efficient. He fixed the fence in an afternoon, working with an economy of motion that came from long practice. The children were afraid of him at first. Miguel especially would watch Alejandro with wide, suspicious eyes, and Rosa would hide behind her mother's skirts whenever he was near. But Alejandro was patient. He never approached them directly, never tried to force interaction. Instead, he would leave small things where they could find them: a whistle carved from willow wood, a small figure of a horse made from twisted grass, a collection of interesting stones. Slowly, very slowly, the children's fear began to give way to curiosity. Miguel was the first to approach, drawn by the whistle. He'd crept out one morning while Alejandro was working and stood at a careful distance, the whistle clutched in his hand. "Did you make this?" Miguel had asked, his voice small but brave. Alejandro had looked up from the fence post he was setting and nodded. "I did. Do you know how to play it?" Miguel had shaken his head, and Alejandro had held out his hand for the whistle. He'd played a simple melody, the notes clear and sweet in the morning air, then handed it back, like that. "It takes practice, but you will learn." Miguel had clutched the whistle to his chest and run back to the house, but the next day he was back, trying to coax sounds from the instrument. And the day after that, within a week, he was following Alejandro around the property, pestering him with endless questions. Rosa took longer, but eventually she too was won over. seduced by Alejandro's quiet patience and the small kindnesses he showed. For Maria, the transformation was slower and more complicated. She was grateful for the help, desperately so, but gratitude warred with suspicion and fear. This was an Apache, a member of a people who had been demonized in every conversation she'd ever heard. The stories were always the same: brutal raids, innocent people killed, homes burned. And yet here was Alejandro working in her fields, gentle with her children, asking nothing in return. "Why?" she asked him one evening as they sat on the porch after a long day of work, watching the sun set over the mountains. "Why do you keep coming back?" He was quiet for a long moment, and she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I had a family once, a wife, 2 sons. They died on the reservation, killed by disease that the white man brought. I left after that, went back to the mountains, but there is nothing for me there now. The old life is gone, and I am too tired to keep fighting for what can never be again. I'm sorry," Maria said, and meant it. He glanced at her, then back at the darkening horizon. "You remind me of her. My wife. She had your strength, your determination. She never gave up, even when giving up would have been easier." He paused. "I could not save her, but perhaps I can help you." Something shifted in Maria's chest, a softening she hadn't felt in a long time. "You have helped me more than you know. Then let me help you more. Let me stay." She looked at him sharply. "Stay, not in your house," he said quickly. "I will build a shelter by the creek, but let me stay on this land. Let me continue to help you work it. In return, I ask only for food and a place to sleep. It is a good arrangement for both of us." Maria knew she should refuse, knew that harboring an Apache, even one who claimed to have left his people, could bring trouble from her white neighbors. The army wouldn't be pleased either, but when she opened her mouth, what came out was, "Yes, you can stay." And so their arrangement became permanent. Alejandro built himself a simple shelter by the creek, little more than a lean-to constructed from branches and hide, but it was enough. He was there every morning when Maria emerged from the house, ready to work. Together, they transformed the homestead. The crops flourished under their combined care. The corn grew tall and straight, the beans climbed their poles with vigor, and the squash spread its leaves in the vegetable garden like green hands reaching for the sun. Alejandro taught Maria to see the land not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a partner to be worked with. He showed her which wild plants were edible, which had medicinal properties, how to read animal tracks and know what had passed through in the night. In return, Maria taught him things too, though she didn't realize it at first. She taught him that not all white settlers were bent on destruction, that some were simply trying to survive, just as the Apache had always done. She taught him that common ground could be found, that old enmities didn't have to define the future. The neighbors noticed, of course. It was impossible for them not to. Johnson rode over one day, his face concerned, and a rifle prominently displayed in his saddle holster. "Maria," he said, not dismounting, "I've been hearing things. Talk about you harboring an Apache." Maria stood in her doorway, arms crossed, and met his gaze steadily. "Alejandro is helping me work the land. That's all. That's all." Johnson's face reddened. "Maria, he's Apache. Do you know what they've done? The people they've killed?" "I know what some Apache have done," Maria said carefully, "just as I know what some white men have done. Alejandro has never threatened me or my children. He works hard, asks for little, and has made it possible for me to keep this land. I won't turn it away because of his blood." Johnson shook his head, clearly frustrated. "People are talking. There might be trouble. Then let them talk. I'm not doing anything wrong." Johnson stared at her for a long moment, then sighed. "I hope you know what you're doing, Maria, for your sake and your children's." He rode away, But Maria knew the conversation wouldn't end there. Sure enough, within a week, 3 men rode up from town. One was the sheriff, a heavy-set man named Dawson, who'd always struck Maria as more politician than lawman. The other 2 were townsmen, property owners who fancied themselves important. Mrs. Gonzalez, Dawson said, touching his hat brim with exaggerated courtesy, "We need to talk about your hired hand." "What about him?" "He's Apache, ma'am. That makes people nervous." Maria felt anger rising in her chest, hot and sharp. "He's one man and he's done nothing wrong. That's not the point. One of the townsmen said, his people have been killing settlers for decades. You can't trust them. His people—" Maria's voice rose. "His people are dead or imprisoned on reservations. He's alone, just like I was alone, and he's been nothing but helpful." Dawson raised a placating hand. "Now, Mrs. Gonzalez, nobody's saying you've done wrong, but you have to understand the concern. What if he's scouting for a larger group? What if he's just waiting for the right moment to turn on?" He's had plenty of moments," Maria shot back. "If he wanted to hurt us, we'd be dead already. Instead, my crops are thriving, my property is in better shape than it's been in years, and my children are safe. That's more than I could say when I was working alone." The 3 men exchanged glances, clearly not having expected such fierce resistance. Dawson tried again. "Ma'am, we're just trying to keep everyone safe. Maybe it would be better if—" "Better if what? If I sent away the only help I have? If I worked myself to death trying to keep this land? My husband claimed this property legally, and I inherited it legally. What I do on my own land is my business, as long as I'm not breaking any laws. Is there a law against hiring an Apache to help with fieldwork?" Dawson's face tightened. "No, ma'am, there's no law against it. But there are other considerations." "Then we're done here," Maria said firmly. "Unless you have legal grounds to order Alejandro off my property, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave." The men left, but Maria knew the problem wouldn't go away. Prejudice was a stubborn weed, harder to root out than anything that grew in her fields. Still, she'd made her decision, and she would stand by it. Alejandro had heard the entire conversation from where he'd been working near the house. When the men were gone, he came to stand beside her on the porch. "I am causing you trouble," he said quietly. "You're causing people to face their own fears." Maria corrected. "That's different. I could go, find another place." She turned to look at him, this man who had appeared in her field 2 months ago and changed everything. "Do you want to go?" He was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. "No, this is the first place I have felt." He searched for the word. "At peace, since before my family died. I would like to stay, if you will let me." "Then stay," Maria said simply. The summer deepened and the work continued. The corn grew tall, and the first ears began to form. The beans were heavy on their poles, and the squash sprawled across half the garden. It was shaping up to be the best harvest Maria had ever seen, and she knew it was because of Alejandro's knowledge and his tireless work ethic. But it was more than just the physical labor. Having another adult to talk to share the burden of decision-making with, had lifted a weight from Maria's shoulders that she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying. They would sit together in the evenings after the children had gone to bed, talking about the day's work, planning for the next day, discussing larger strategies for the land. Alejandro told her stories of his people, of the old ways that were disappearing. He spoke of the raids too, not glorifying them but not apologizing either, explaining them as acts of survival in a world that was changing too fast, that was trying to erase his people from existence. Maria listened, and in listening, she began to understand that the story she'd been told all her life was far more complicated than she'd realized. In turn, she told him about Vicent, about the dreams they'd had for this land, about the children and their futures. She spoke of her fears, her exhaustion, her determination to hold onto what her husband had died to claim. Alejandro listened with the same attention she'd given him, and in his silence she found a kind of acceptance she hadn't known she needed. Miguel had taken to following Alejandro everywhere, soaking up knowledge like the earth soaked up rain. The boy was learning to track, to identify plants, to move quietly through the brush. He was also learning Apache words, much to Maria's mixed feelings. But when she saw the pride in her son's face as he successfully identified the tracks of a deer, when she heard him laugh as Alejandro showed him how to make a simple snare, she couldn't bring herself to stop it. Rosa, quieter and more reserved than her brother, had formed her own bond with Alejandro. He would carve small animals for her, an entire menagerie that she kept in a box by her bed. Sometimes she would sit near him while he worked, chattering about nothing in particular, and he would listen with patient attention, occasionally asking a question that would send her off into new flights of story. In those moments, Maria would watch them and feel something warm and complicated in her chest. This was not what she had expected when Alejandro first appeared in her field. She had expected danger, threat, fear. Instead, she had found help, companionship, and something that was beginning to feel like family. But the outside world was not willing to let them exist in peace. The talk in town continued, growing more heated as the weeks passed. There were those who viewed Maria's arrangement with Alejandro as a betrayal, a dangerous precedent that could not be tolerated. Others were simply afraid, convinced that one Apache on a homestead was the first step toward more violence. The tension came to a head one evening in late July. Maria was in the house preparing dinner when she heard horses approaching. Not one or two, but many. She looked out the window and felt her stomach drop. At least a dozen men, some she recognized from town, others she didn't know, all armed and all heading toward her property. Alejandro, she called, keeping her voice as calm as she could. Take the children to the creek, now. He appeared in the doorway, took one look at the approaching riders, and nodded. He scooped up Rosa, who'd been playing near the table, and grabbed Miguel's hand. Come, quickly and quietly, Mama. Miguel's voice was frightened. Go with Alejandro, Maria said firmly. I'll be fine, go. They disappeared out the back as the riders entered her yard. Maria stepped out onto the porch, her heart hammering but her face composed. She recognized some of the men, townspeople, a few ranchers, and at the back, looking uncomfortable, Sheriff Dawson. The man who rode at the front was someone she didn't know, a tall, angular figure with hard eyes and a cruel mouth. He dismounted with deliberate slowness, clearly intending to intimidate. Mrs. Gonzalez, he said, his tone making her name sound like an insult. I'm Tom Fletcher. These men and I have come to talk to you about your Apache. His name is Alejandro, Maria said coldly, and I don't recall inviting any of you onto my property. Fletcher's expression darkened. You don't seem to understand the seriousness of the situation, ma'am. You're harboring a savage on your land. That puts all of us at risk. He's not a savage, and he's not putting anyone at risk. That's not for you to decide. Fletcher took a step closer to the porch. We're a community here, and the community has decided that we can't tolerate Apache on our lands. It's time for your hired hand to move on. Maria felt rage rising in her throat, hot and choking. This is my land. My property. You have no right to tell me who I can or cannot have here. We have every right to protect ourselves. Fletcher shot back. If you won't send him away, we'll do it for you. You'll do no such thing. Maria's voice was steel. This is my property, and you're trespassing. Sheriff Dawson, are you going to allow this? Dawson shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Mrs. Gonzalez, Maybe it would be better if you just listened to what these men have to say. I've heard what they have to say, and the answer is no. Alejandro stays. Fletcher's hand moved to the gun at his hip, and Maria felt ice slide down her spine. But before anyone could do anything else, a voice came from the side of the house. Perhaps you should listen to the lady. Everyone turned to see Alejandro standing there, no weapon visible but his stance radiating readiness. He'd circled back, Maria realized, made sure the children were safe, and then returned. Her heart lurched with both gratitude and fear. Fletcher's face twisted into something ugly. Well. The Apache shows himself. That makes this easier. You are not welcome here. Alejandro said calmly. This woman has given me shelter and work. I have done nothing to harm her or her children or anyone in this territory. Your quarrel is not with me. It is with your own fear. My quarrel, Fletcher snarled, is with every Apache who's ever killed good Christian folk. And that includes you. He drew his gun, and time seemed to slow down. Maria saw the weapon rising, saw Alejandro's body tense to move, saw Sheriff Dawson reaching for his own gun, though she couldn't tell if it was to stop Fletcher or to join him. And then she did something without thinking, something that would later terrify her when she remembered it. She threw herself down the porch steps and put herself between Fletcher's gun and Alejandro. No, she shouted. You will not do this. Not on my land. Not to a man who has done nothing wrong. Fletcher's hand wavered, the gun pointing now at Maria instead of Alejandro. For a long, terrible moment, she thought he might pull the trigger anyway. But then Dawson was there, pushing his horse between Fletcher and Maria. That's enough, the sheriff said, his voice carrying an authority it had previously lacked. Fletcher put the gun down. This has gone far enough. She's protecting a hostel. She's standing on her own property, and last I checked, we don't shoot women for choosing their own employees. Dawson looked around at the assembled men, his face hard. All of you, listen to me. I don't like this situation any more than you do, but there's no law being broken here. Mrs. Gonzalez has the right to hire who she wants. If you don't like it, you can take it up with the territorial government. But you're not taking the law into your own hands. Not in my county. Fletcher looked like he wanted to argue, but several of the other men were already reining their horses around, looking uncomfortable or ashamed. The confrontation had gone further than they'd intended, and now they just wanted to leave. This isn't over, Fletcher said, but he holstered his gun and swung back into his saddle. You're making a mistake, Sheriff. And you, Mrs. Gonzalez, you're going to regret protecting that savage. The only thing I regret, Maria said, her voice shaking now with reaction, is living among people who judge a man by his birth rather than his actions. The men rode away, and Maria's legs suddenly felt weak. She sat down hard on the porch steps, her whole body trembling. Alejandro moved to stand beside her, his hand briefly touching her shoulder in a gesture of support. You should not have done that, he said quietly. He might have shot you. He might have shot you, Maria countered, and I couldn't let that happen. Not after everything you've done for us. Dawson, who had remained behind, dismounted and approached them carefully. Mrs. Gonzalez, Alejandro, I want to apologize for that. Fletcher's a hothead, and he brought men who think like he does. But what you said is true. There's no law against what you're doing here. But there's also no law protecting us. Maria said bitterly. No, Dawson admitted, there's not. And I can't be here every day. You need to understand that there are people in this territory who will never accept an Apache living among them. What happened today could happen again. Then it happens again. Maria said stubbornly, I'm not sending Alejandro away. Dawson sighed. I figured you'd say that. Just be careful. Both of you. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving them alone in the gathering darkness. Maria sat there for a long moment, then said, I need to check on the children. They found Miguel and Rosa exactly where Alejandro had left them, hidden in a dense thicket by the creek. Miguel had his arms around his sister, and both of them looked frightened but unhurt. When they saw Maria, they ran to her, and she held them tightly, feeling tears sting her eyes for the first time since Vicent's death. "It's all right," she whispered into Miguel's hair. "Everything's all right." But it wasn't. Not really. That night, after the children were asleep, Maria and Alejandro sat together on the porch, not speaking, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Maria broke the silence. "You could leave," she said. "Go to Mexico, or further into the mountains. You don't have to stay here and risk this kind of danger." "I could." Alejandro agreed. "But then, what would you do?" "Return to working yourself to death. Lose this land that your husband died to claim. Better that than see you killed because of me." He turned to look at her, his face serious in the moonlight. "And if I said the same to you, that you should take your children and leave, go somewhere safer, rather than risk what Fletcher and men like him might do?" "I'd say this is my home, this is where I belong. Then you understand why I cannot leave." He paused, then added, "This is the first place I have belonged since my family died. These children, they are teaching me to hope again. You are teaching me that perhaps the world is not all hatred and war. How can I leave that?" Maria felt something break open inside her chest, some wall she'd built around her heart after Vicent's death. "I don't know what we're doing here," she said softly. "I don't know if this can work, if we can make people accept this. Perhaps we cannot make them accept it," Alejandro said, "but perhaps we can do it anyway. Live our lives, work this land, raise these children. Perhaps that is enough." Maria thought about his words for a long time after they'd parted for the night. Alejandro to his shelter by the creek, and Maria to her cold bed in the empty house. Perhaps it was enough. Perhaps, in a world that seemed determined to tear itself apart along lines of race and hatred, the simple act of refusing to participate in that hatred was its own form of resistance. The summer rolled on, the corn grew tall, and the time for harvest approached. Maria and Alejandro worked side by side, their partnership now tempered by the shared danger they'd faced. The children went back to their routines, though Miguel now practiced with the knife Alejandro had given him, learning to throw it at a target drawn on a tree trunk. Rosa continued to collect her carved animals, and her laughter once again filled the house. But they were more careful now. Alejandro took to sleeping in the barn rather than by the creek, where he could hear if anyone approached in the night. Maria made sure her husband's rifle was always loaded and within reach. They didn't speak of it, but they both knew that Fletcher or men like him might return. The harvest came in September, and it was everything Maria had hoped for. The corn was abundant, the beans were plentiful, and the squash had produced more than they could possibly eat. For the first time since Vicent's death, Maria could look at her stores and feel secure in the knowledge that her children would eat well through the winter. She insisted on sharing the harvest with Alejandro over his protests. "Half of everything," she said, because he'd done half the work. More than half, if she was honest. He accepted, though she suspected he would give most of it away to the Mexican families who lived in hills, people even poorer than they were. The day after the last of the harvest was brought in, Maria made a decision. She would go to town, sell what surplus they had, and use the money to buy things they needed, and she would take Alejandro with her. Let people see them together, let them understand that she would not be ashamed or intimidated. Alejandro thought it was a bad idea, but Maria was stubborn. "If we hide," she said, "we let them believe they were right to threaten us. I won't do that. I won't teach my children to live in fear." So they hitched up the wagon, loaded it with sacks of corn and beans, and headed to town. Miguel and Rosa stayed home, under strict instructions not to leave the house. It was a risk, but Maria judged it a smaller risk than taking them into a town that might be hostile. The ride took most of the morning. Maria drove, and Alejandro sat beside her, his face carefully neutral. As they approached the town, Maria could feel tension radiating from him, and she reached over to briefly touch his hand. "We'll be fine," she said, hoping it was true. The town was small, barely more than a collection of buildings along a single dirt road. There was a general store, a saloon, a church, a blacksmith, and a handful of other establishments. As they drove down the main street, Maria was aware of people stopping